Welcome everyone. It's time for another edition of my Reader's Guide series, which is a series of videos where I take one classic work of fiction and go really deep into the story, the plot, the characters, the themes, and this one has been something I've been promising for a long time. I think this goes back years now, but I'm finally getting around to it, and that is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, published originally in 1818, and it is considered to be not only a landmark Gothic novel, but possibly one of the first science fiction novels, and it certainly pioneered the genre of science fiction as we know it, and it has one of the archetypal science fiction tropes in its mad scientist, Victor Frankenstein, who is driven mad by his ambition and the creation of his creature. But not only is this novel forward-thinking in terms of setting the conventions for a new genre and pushing forward in terms of science fiction, it's also something that digs deep into the past, and this is reflected in its original subtitle, The Modern Prometheus. For those of you who don't know, Prometheus is an ancient Greek figure who was known for stealing fire from the gods and giving it to humans. And he's the archetypal Greek idea of someone who is driven by ambition and doesn't really consider the consequences of giving technology, in this case fire, to human beings. Obviously fire has great value to humans, but it also causes great destruction. And so we have this great combination in Shelley's Frankenstein with this past, reaching out to the past for this myth, this mythological idea, but then also pushing it into the future with this concern for science, which obviously was growing massively in Shelley's time. In this video though, we're not going to get too much into the themes of the novel. Instead, I want to give a little bit of background into who Mary Shelley is, the creation of Frankenstein the story, as that is a legend in its own right, and then end the video with a plot synopsis, a detailed plot synopsis of the story. Part 1. Who was Mary Shelley? Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley was born on the 30th of August 1797 in London, England. She has pretty illustrious parents. She was the daughter of William Godwin, a renowned political philosopher and an early proponent of the moral theory utilitarianism, which is very briefly the idea that the moral decisions that we make should be about maximizing as much happiness or pleasure and minimizing suffering. She was also the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, a pioneering feminist thinker in her day, who was known mostly for writing The Vindication on the Rights of Women. Although Mary was definitely inspired by and lived up to many of her mother's ambitions and views on women being just as capable and rational as men, she didn't get to experience her mother, who died tragically just 10 days after Mary was born. Nevertheless, William did provide Mary with an excellent education. Mary also led quite an unconventional and certainly scandalous life for her time period as well. When she was 16, she eloped with the famous poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, and he was already married at the time. Obviously this caused a great scandal and led for both of them to be ostracized throughout most of their lives. Her life was also marked by lots of tragedy, not only with Percy's early death, but the early deaths of her children. In fact, only one of her children, Percy Shelley, lived through to adulthood. Another unconventional aspect to Shelley's life was that she and her husband were both vegetarians, and this is something that actually comes about in the novel, as we will see. The creature himself is a vegetarian, and this is meant to reflect his innocence compared to human beings who do kill animals for sustenance. It's certainly true that one of the fundamental themes of Frankenstein, as we'll see, is the hatred for the abuse of life that goes on in the pursuit of science, and her vegetarianism in many ways reflects this. Due to Shelley's education, she was also aware of many of the big thinkers of her day, in particular Rousseau and his idea of human nature as benevolent and innocent and pure. This is something that we see again in the novel with the development of the creature, who is corrupted by society, but innately he is pure in his natural state. She was also familiar with the ideas of the philosopher John Locke, in particular his idea of human nature as a kind of tabula rasa, in the sense that we begin with nothing innate. We don't have an innate moral disposition or innate ideas, and we come to develop these things through experience. And again, this is something that we'll see going into the novel and looking at how the creature develop. These ideas were also known to her father, who also believed in the tabula rasa theory, was obviously a utilitarian, and these are all things that you find coming into the novel, these moral theories and ideas of the day. In 1816, the Shelleys would travel to Geneva in the early summer along with Lord Byron, and they would stay at a residence in Montagule near Cologne. And it's here that Shelley would begin work on Frankenstein, which would eventually be published in 1818, to a somewhat mixed reception. but obviously over time it became way more well known and famous. Unfortunately though, Shelley's marriage to Percy was brief, ending less than 10 years after they first got together. Percy died in a boating accident at just the age of 29. Shelley did continue to write novels during her lifetime, although again she never met with the resounding success and fame which she has now. This is something that came much later, arguably when Frankenstein captured the popular imagination, and in fact Frankenstein and the creature became so embedded with each other that they just became known as Frankenstein, even though in the book, as we'll see, Frankenstein is the name of the doctor, not the creature. Throughout her life, she spent as much time writing as she did devoting her life to her children. She was deeply devoted to her surviving son Percy, and she was also devoted to bringing up the name of her husband, getting his poems published, and arguably her work in these endeavours was a big part of why he became such a big name in the end. Because like her, he wasn't massively influential in his own time. This is something that was developed through her efforts and the efforts of others, and of course the people that Shelley inspired with his poetry. Shelley died on February 1st, 1851, after about a decade-long illness, which her physician believed was caused by a brain tumour. On the first anniversary of her death, her relatives opened a box that she kept in her desk, and here they found locks of her dead children's hair, a notebook that she shared with Percy Shelley, and a copy of his poem Adonis, with one page folded around a silk parcel containing some of his ashes and the remains of his heart. Part 2. The Gothic Writing Contest. So the creation of Frankenstein, as I said, is somewhat legendary, in fact just as legendary you might say as the novel itself. In the summer of 1816, as I said, Mary travelled with Percy, Lord Byron, and also John Polidori, who was Byron's physician, not a writer by any means, and they travelled together to Geneva. Unfortunately, this trip didn't turn out to be as exciting at first as they planned, as it was raining and there were lots of storms, and so they kept inside for most of the time. But being the creative people that they were, they decided to tell lots of ghost stories, and eventually this got round to them having a contest where they would all try and write the most terrifying ghost story that they could think of. In the introduction to one of the editions of Frankenstein, Mary discusses how she initially struggled to come up with an idea for the story, but one night after listening to Byron and Shelley talking about the possibility of creating life through science, she ended up being quite inspired by their conversation, and this led to her having a very intense nightmare, which pretty much describes the moment in the book where Frankenstein creates his monster. It's almost like her dream was a vision of this particular scene, and from that point on, the story just unraveled. It came to her through that dream. Arguably, of course, Shelley won this little contest, although it is worth mentioning Polidori's The Vampire, which was another landmark work insofar as it also pioneered the genre of vampire fiction as we know it. Interestingly as well, both of these novels were initially wrongly attributed. Frankenstein was originally published anonymously, and everyone assumed, because Percy Shelley wrote the foreword to the original edition, that he was the author of the book, and this was later clarified in later editions. But people also thought that Byron wrote Polidori's novel as well, although this was also clarified. Part 3. Summary. Frankenstein begins with a letter written by Captain Richard Walton, an adventurous sailor who is seeking glory by leading an expedition to the North Pole, and this letter is written to his sister in England. As the sailors near their destination, they discover a man stranded on the ice, and this man is, of course, Victor Frankenstein, who is near death. Walton finds a kindred spirit in Victor, and after helping to nurse him for a while, Frankenstein decides to tell the tragic story of his life and what led him to be stranded in the Arctic. From this point on, the story is predominantly told from Victor's perspective. Victor begins his tale by going over his early childhood life. He is born into a wealthy, loving family in Geneva. His father, Alphonse Frankenstein, is a man of public service and integrity, and his mother, Caroline Buffaut, is the daughter of a once prominent nobleman who fell into poverty. Alphonse was once close friends with Caroline's father, and so when he discovers this, he eventually manages to save Caroline from this fate of poverty, takes her to live with him, and eventually the two grow close and marry each other. And it is this marriage that leads to the birth of Victor. It also leads to the adoption of Elizabeth Lavenza, who the pair discover while on a trip to Italy. Victor's childhood looks pretty good. He describes it as an idyllic one, he's nurtured by these loving parents, and he describes himself as feeling as though that he is their plaything and idol. He develops a deep friendship with Elizabeth as well, who he describes as his more than sister and the beautiful companion of all his occupations and pleasures. Elizabeth is described as a grounding figure for Victor, and in comparison to him, because Victor has a much more adventurous and inquisitive spirit, always seeking for knowledge and mysteries, while Elizabeth is much more content with the world as it is. Victor's first intellectual obsession comes when he discovers the works of the philosopher and alchemist Cornelius Agrippa, and this also leads him to discover the works of Paracelsus and Albertus Magnus, alchemists and occult philosophers who sought mastery over the natural world. Victor's father is amused and somewhat derisive of Victor's obsession, although he doesn't really explain to Victor why this is a ridiculous obsession, and so Victor just becomes more and more interested in these crazy ideas. The family meets with their first tragedy with the death of Caroline. She dies of scarlet fever, which she contracts from Elizabeth, while she's nursing Elizabeth, who also gets the fever, but Elizabeth does survive. Soon after this, Victor departs for the University of Ingolstadt, where he begins his career as a natural philosopher and scientist. Once again, he finds himself ridiculed for his obsessions with Agrippa and the like, especially by one of his teachers known as M. Krempe. However, he also finds a champion in another professor, M. Waldman, who encourages him to blend the ancient curiosity with these zany ideas with the modern scientific method. And this is the sort of real inspiration for Victor to begin his experiments and into the nature of life and death, and eventually to him creating the creature. His obsession soon takes over. He stops writing to his family and focuses instead entirely on his study and his experiments. As readers, we never know the precise details of what Victor is doing, how he creates the monster. As we learn later, this is a deliberate choice by Victor because he doesn't want anyone else to create a monster in the way that he did. Nevertheless, Victor does succeed in his task. He creates human life, presumably from assembled body parts. But at the moment his creature awakes, Victor is overcome by fear, dread, and horror at what he's done, and so he abandons his experiment and his creation and falls into a deep mental sickness. Victor might have died in this state, but fortunately his close friend Henry Clerval arrives in town, also to study at university, and focuses on tending Victor until he is better, and then Victor also finally receives some word from home. Elizabeth writes that all is well at first. She tells of a young woman named Justine Moritz, who was taken in by the family as a servant and surrogate daughter. Justine was from a large poor family, and her mother was cruel to her, and that was why the family decided to rescue her from this terrible situation. Another act of compassion from this very caring family, and obviously this is quite in contrast to Victor, who has just abandoned his creature. Elizabeth writes that she's looking for the day when they can all be together again, but unfortunately, tragedy soon strikes, and she writes another letter to Victor, explaining that his youngest brother, William, has been strangled to death. Victor fears that his creature might have had something to do with this, and he is even more sure when, on returning home, he sees the creature in the town, and so he immediately assumes that the creature must be behind this. Unfortunately though, before he can do anything about this, Justine Moritz is accused of the murder. Victor learns that on the day of William's death, William asked Elizabeth if he could have a little locket that had a picture of his mother inside, and Elizabeth gave him this locket. And when the boy was found dead, this locket was missing and later found on Justine's body, and that's why people believe that she is the killer. In reality, Justine was out looking for William, she fell asleep, and we will later learn that the creature planted the locket on her body after murdering William. Although he strongly believes that Justine is innocent, Victor remains silent throughout her trial, hoping that the circumstantial evidence won't be enough to condemn Justine for the crime. Justine does profess her innocence in court, and she is backed by very kind words from Elizabeth, who testifies as to the goodness of Justine's character. But unfortunately, a hostile audience and jury decide that Justine is guilty regardless. They see her as ungrateful and a poor wretch. After the trial, things get even worse for Justine, as she's berated into confessing by her priest, who tells her that she will be damned forever if she doesn't confess. And this makes things doubly worse for her, as she's not only condemned by everyone else, but now in her eyes by God as well. Horrified by what she's done, Justine calls for Elizabeth to explain her confession and her anxieties now about being doubly damned. Victor is also present when Justine tells Elizabeth about her false confession, but again, although he is horrified by what he's hearing, he still refuses to speak. Justine is inevitably condemned and executed. After this second death, caused at least partly by himself, Victor decides to travel to the country for some respite and to relieve his spirits. Although he finds some consolation in nature, this is all destroyed when he comes across the creature. While Victor rebukes the creature at once, he's surprised to find that the creature is well-spoken and rational. The creature entreats Victor to listen to his story, and Victor eventually consents. Thus we get the second volume of the story, which is mostly focused on the creature, explaining his side of the story, leading up to the deaths of William and Justine, which we will learn that he did actually cause. The creature begins his tale with his creation, which he remembers only in hazy fragments. He remembers being overwhelmed by light, sound, and sensation, and he wanders aimlessly for a time as he grows accustomed to the world. He subsists on a diet of berries and water, and we later learn that he is a herbivore. He relates his early experiences with humans. Villagers scream when they see him, they throw stones at him, and chase him away due to his hideous appearance. Because of this, he becomes very distrusting of human beings, although he does always have the impulse to try and befriend them. He eventually finds a hovel nearby a cottage, and he becomes enamored by the poor family who live there. The family consists of a blind man called De Lacy and his children Felix and Agatha. Fearing to expose himself to them and be rejected once again, the creature observes them from a safe distance, and he even helps them secretly by doing their chores, leaving wood on their doorsteps during the night. As he observes the family, the creature begins to develop a moral character and a personality. He's able to teach himself to read from books that he comes across, in particular Milton's Paradise Lost, in which he identifies both with Adam as a creature that is abandoned by its creator, and Satan as a rejected outcast, Plutarch's Lives, an ancient biography of the ancient Greeks, from which he develops his understanding of morality, society, and politics, and lastly, Goethe's Sorrows of Young Werther, which is a romantic, tragic tale of unrequited love that ends in suicide. One night, a young woman called Safi, the daughter of a wealthy Turkish merchant and lover of Felix, arrives at the cottage, having fled her father. The creature manages to get hold of letters that Safi wrote to Felix, and these tell us a little bit about the background of the family and how they came to fall into poverty. Safi's father was unjustly imprisoned, and De Lacy tried to help the man by breaking him out of prison. Felix and Safi fell in love with each other, and Safi's father played along with this love insofar as he thought it would help the De Lacys keep them on side to help him get out of prison. But as soon as he escaped, he reneged on his commitment to their love, and he escaped with his daughter. Fortunately, Safi was able to escape her father, and so she ran away and fled to live with Felix and his family in the woods. From the story, the creature not only becomes more deeply connected to the family, desiring even more to reveal himself to them, but again he learns something more about morality here. He sees how human beings are not only cruel to him, but also they can be cruel to each other, they can betray each other, but they're also capable of deep love and commitment to one another as well. And so one day he decides he's going to reveal himself to the family. He decides that it would be best to wait for Safi, Felix and Agatha to go away from the house and to reveal himself first to De Lacy because he is blind and therefore won't have that immediate horror and rejection. He hopes that he'll be able to get De Lacy on side and then reveal himself to the whole family. Initially, De Lacy does seem to be responsive to the creature, but unfortunately the family return. They're immediately horrified by what they see, thinking that De Lacy is being attacked by a monster, and so the creature is driven out of the home and out of society once again. Although he's initially furious at this, the creature does have a moment of softness. He thinks that maybe the family just overreacted, and so he returns to the house hoping that he might be able to explain himself, only to find that they have fled the house and have no intention of returning. Truly heartbroken and furious, the creature burns down the house and renounces all hope of human companionship. He also vows to seek out his creator, who he blames for all of his suffering. On his journey to find his creator, the creature continues to be vilified by humanity, even when he tries to help them. He comes across a drowning woman and saves her life, only to be shot at by her guardian. Then he comes across Victor's younger brother William, an innocent child, and he thinks that because the child is young, he might not have imbibed all of the prejudices that older adults have, and so he tries once again to befriend a person, but unfortunately William does reject the creature. The creature ends up becoming enraged, and he strangles William to death. He takes the locket from William's body, and later that day when he finds Justine sleeping, he decides to leave William's locket on her body so that she will be wrongfully accused of the murder. After finishing his story, the creature demands that Victor make a companion for him, a monster that is just as hideous as himself, so that the monster will be just as outcast as him, and the two will have to be dependent on one another. He vows that if Victor does this, he will leave human beings alone for the rest of time, he won't harm another person, he will just live in peace with his companion. Victor is actually moved by the creature's story, although he still can't quite get over the creature's hideous appearance, but he does eventually agree to the creature's demand. Victor returns home, and initially he puts off his promise to the monster, pursuing the project only in short bursts here and there and at a distance. He spends more time with his family again, but his fear of the monster growing impatient forces him back to his work. He realizes that he'll once again have to leave the country in order to do this project, and so he embarks on a tour of England, both to gather scientific knowledge for his experiments and because he wants to conduct his experiments as far away as possible from his family. Henry Clerval, though, does insist on coming with Victor for some of his travels, and so the two take a bit of a meandering tour through Europe and then also Britain as well. Victor does have brief moments in this period where he gets lost in nature and Henry's wonderful companionship, but eventually he starts to push Henry away, and eventually he goes on his own to complete his experiments. Leaving Henry behind, Victor travels to the Orkney Islands in Scotland, choosing a remote island that is completely battered by the sea. It's a very violent, hostile place, completely isolated, to begin his final task. But as he begins to work on his new creation, and as he's almost about to finish his new creation, Victor has a change of heart. He begins to consider the consequences of creating a lover for the monster. What if the two don't love each other? What if they reproduce and there are lots of other monsters? What if this creature is not like the monster and actually has no morality or softness at all? One night, the creature arrives on the island ready to claim his companion. But Victor, having changed his mind, destroys the companion right in front of the creature. Enraged and vengeful, the creature warns Victor, "I will be with you on your wedding night." And then he disappears. Victor believes the creature will murder him on his wedding night. Victor then decides to dispose of all of the evidence of his creation. He sails out to sea and dumps it all into the waters, but a storm blows him off course and he ends up in Ireland, where he is immediately arrested. This is one of those very bizarre circumstantial things that happens in old novels, but we find out that a murder has taken place, and Victor is horrified to learn that Henry has been murdered. He's been strangled to death, presumably by the monster. Several witnesses say that they saw a man on a boat out to sea, and because Victor was caught blowing in from the sea, it is assumed that he is the monster. Victor once again falls into a great illness at this, but thanks to the sympathy of an Irish magistrate called Mr. Kerwin, Victor's father is sent for, and Victor eventually recovers and is eventually acquitted for the murder. Victor returns to England with his father, and he decides that he will marry Elizabeth, despite the monster's warning. He believes that the creature means to harm him, not Elizabeth, and so he prepares himself for a confrontation on the wedding night. He also promises to tell Elizabeth everything the day after their marriage. But unfortunately, Victor was wrong to worry for himself. The creature waits until Elizabeth withdraws to bed on the evening of their wedding night, then he breaks into her room and murders her. In the wake of this tragedy, Alphonse Frankenstein, Victor's father, also dies of grief. With nothing left, Victor vows revenge on the creature, and he devotes the rest of his life to the creature's destruction. He begins to chase the creature all across Europe, eventually cutting across Russia and up to the Arctic Circle. Clearly wanting Victor to pursue him, the creature leaves behind messages and clues for Victor to follow, and even leaves him food behind as well. Eventually, the pursuit leads Victor to cross paths with Walton, and the story reaches the present moment once again. Now going back to the present moment with Walton's letters, Walton recalls Victor's final words. Victor warns Walton against ambition, and he entreats him to learn from his mistakes. But at the same time, Victor seems to contradict himself, because he also chastises Walton's shipmates when they express reluctance to continue with the expedition to the Arctic because they're afraid of getting stranded and dying. Nevertheless, Victor dies shortly after, and then Walton discovers the creature crying over Victor's body. The creature expresses sadness at Victor's death, and although he admits that he still has hatred and rage, he also has regrets for what happened. He acknowledges that his crimes have not brought him any peace, and with Victor dead, he has no purpose left. With no purpose left, the creature assures Walton that he will soon die anyway. He tells Walton that he will burn himself on a funeral pyre at the end of the earth, leaving no trace of his remains, and then he disappears into the Arctic wasteland. So that's it for the first episode of this Reader's Guide. In the next episode, we're going to be looking at Victor and then the creature, and then we're going to look at some of the secondary characters like Elizabeth, Justine, and Henry, and then after that we'll get onto some of the themes. I'm thinking that I might also do a bonus video, so if you are interested in a certain theme that you don't think I'm covering or that you want me to elaborate on, leave a suggestion in the comments and I might make a bonus episode at the end of the series focusing on those themes, or if there isn't something that I think is sufficient enough for an entire video, what I might do is, if you just have a question, ask away, and I might have like a Q&A on Frankenstein at the end of the series. And that is everything for this video. Take care everyone, and I'll see you in the next episode of the Frankenstein Reader's Guide. Ta-ra!